Hi, it's Greg again, and I'm going to show you today a pattern that I've implemented. It has to do with maintaining items in SharePoint lists. It gets a little hairy, but I have found it extremely valuable. So I created this flow called an item entity, and it's designed to manage CRUD around an item. And I did another video that talked about this pattern where you pass an object that's got properties that you need. It also takes something called a flow context that gets passed through the call chain. But I've done a couple of things here. One is I've localized all the CRUD SharePoint connectors, create, update, delete, into one flow. So other flows can call it, they can wrap it, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But ideally, those connectors will only get referenced in one place. That means I have to make it pretty flexible, but it limits, I think, potential errors. I personally find the Power Automate environment very fragile. So very early on, I wanted to localize all these connectors in one flow. And this flow starts feeling a little bit like an object that you can use to manage items in a SharePoint list. It's not, but let's take a look at the inputs, and then I'll show you a little bit of the logic, and then I'll show you this wrapping concept, how this flow can be wrapped. So I'm going to start with the JSON object that you pass to it. So you give it a site reference. That can either be the key to a site profile, and I see a misspelling here, or it can actually be a URL, the list name. In this case, I'm going to retrieve it by ID. I give it an operation, which is update. And then there are some column value pairs. This is an array, and I'm going to change the title to new value. Some other column, I might give it another one. This might be status, and I might call this updated or something like that. So you pass this to the flow, and I can add new properties to this. It takes a bunch more properties. It basically is a superset of all the properties that these different connectors or actions take. So you can really specify, you can limit the number of rows returned, you can limit the columns that are returned by just passing different properties here. If we go back to the flow, I'll give you kind of an overview. Here's my try block. This is where the main logic is. I will see if item JSON was actually passed. There's a reason for that I won't go into, but sometimes it's convenient to already pass JSON. If you retrieved it from a query, for example, this block determines, or this condition determines, if I need to retrieve an item. So if I'm going to, mainly read, I need to retrieve. This takes either a key or an ID or a filter query and processes those in order. So it will try, if you pass an ID, it will try to retrieve it by the ID. If you pass a key, it will try to find a particular value in a particular column. And you can stack these. You can pass all of them. If the ID retrieval fails, it'll do it by key. And finally, you can just pass a filter query. So pretty robust. You also pass this operation, which tells it, do I need to just read it? Or do I need to do deletions? Do I need to do updates? Do I need to do create? And the cool thing is, potentially dangerous as well, you can pass a filter query and tell it to delete all those items. So this is really one-stop shopping for item CRUD. And you just pass the object and it will return true. It always returns an array of items. JSON for those items, even if it just retrieves one thing. That makes it a little bit more consistent for the caller. So this is the basic flow. You have to pass the site reference with a URL or a link to one of these documents. This document is basically just a key that has a URL associated with it so that I don't hard code URLs in my flows. And then this is the item entity profile, and it knows how to dereference that profile. So I really kind of misspoke. In the first flow I showed you, you need to pass the URL. Here you can either pass a reference to one of the documents I showed you or a URL, the list name, the ID, the basic coordinates for an item or a set of items. And then I've actually wrapped this in something called content block getter. So I have content blocks where I can just go out and grab an arbitrary set of text or HTML. That comes in super handy. And it simply provides defaults for the list name and for the site reference. So you don't have to pass those. You can call this flow and you can just pass an ID or a key, and it will know where to go to get the stuff. You can also override those if you choose. That's something I decided to do. But the logic in this thing, there's some error handling and stuff, but it's really pretty slim. It just looks at what you pass it, sees if you didn't pass, for example, a list name, and provides a default list name, and then calls the chain that we saw. And all of those share something. They have a parameter called a flow context. So if this one fails, it can write a message to the flow context, which would come back to this flow, which would come back to this flow. And you can see that the basic plumbing is there to also do, stack tracing and a bunch of other stuff. So a little bit heavy, but an interesting pattern, I think, that tries to centralize the use of all the SharePoint item operations in one place. I have another one, by the way, that does this with HTML, provides a standard interface. And I can't remember if I've shown this. Almost all my flows have a documentation compose action. And if you go in there, you will see basically documentation for this flow. It's not the full documentation, but gives you some idea of, interesting things about it. So hope this was helpful and inspires you to avoid putting URLs inside your flows, using the same connector in a bunch of different places if you don't need to, standardizing that so that if there's some update, if there's some change, of course, that creates a single point of failure. If, this thing fails, a lot of stuff will fail. But I have found that now if I have a new type of item, wrapping it and making it completely accessible, all CRUD is extremely fast. And that has made my development faster and more robust, I believe.